He was once the heartbeat of ACDC, the man behind the riffs that shook the world. And yet, when he passed away, he seemed to vanish almost completely from the public's memory. Malcolm Young, the genius who kept time, was suddenly gone. No clear explanation. No images from his final years. When news of his death was finally announced, many people were stunned. Hadn't he already left us long ago? Some called it protection, but others wondered, why was such a crucial part of Malcolm's life completely hidden? Why were even his closest friends unable to see him? An artist who once stood before oceans of people. In the end, left behind only silence. And that silence, even now, is still debated. What really happened in those missing years of Malcolm Young? And why did the silence weigh so heavily? Chapter 1. From a poor immigrant boy to the foundation of ACDC. Before becoming the soul of ACDC, Malcolm Young was just a shivering boy inside a damp, cold apartment in Glasgow. People said the winter of 1963 was harsh enough to kill a poor family. It was during that bitter season that his parents made a life-altering decision to leave their homeland and board a one-way ship bound for Australia. No one could have imagined that the journey would turn a quiet child into the timekeeper of the world, while also planting a silent shadow in him that never disappeared. When they arrived in Sydney, there was no paradise as promised in the brochures. Instead, they were placed in Villawood Migrant Hostel, a sprawl of curved metal huts that were stifling in the summer heat. For many who lived there, Villawood felt more like a military camp than a home. A family friend remembered, the kids would sit outside on the dusty ground, and the guitar was their only toy. It was there that Malcolm and his younger brother Angus quietly watched their older brother George and his close friend Harry Vanda practice. On hot nights, the sound of guitars drifted through the camp, pushing back the loneliness of exile. Malcolm was different. He spoke little, smiled even less, and would sit for hours simply watching George's fingers move across the strings. A neighbor recalled, Malcolm had eyes that were unusually deep, like he was memorizing every single note. People say he always carried a thin notebook, filling it with fragments of melodies. No one paid much attention. But years later, when ACDC became famous, those riffs sounded eerily similar to the ones he had once written down. The Young family eventually left Villawood and settled at No. 4 Burleigh Street in Burwood. The small house quickly turned into a music den. Guitars lay scattered across the rooms, strings tangled on the floor. Neighbors recalled that on hot summer nights, people would gather outside the window just to listen to the boys play. Inside that cramped room, Malcolm found his escape. The immigrant boy poured his focus into rhythm. No need to show off. No need to stand in front, only to be steady, reliable, unshakable. Years later, that became the Malcolm Young signature. Never flashy, but utterly irreplaceable. And yet, there was always something few ever mentioned. A childhood friend recalled, even when he smiled, Malcolm seemed distant, as if he was holding something back for himself. A quiet shadow had already settled in the boy of 10. From the freezing streets of Cranhill to the sweltering huts of Villawood, from a cramped flat to the noisy Burwood house. Malcolm grew up in contradictions, poor yet surrounded by music, a stranger yet finding his identity through sound. And the unanswered question remains, was it those harsh immigrant years that planted the seeds of the mysterious silence that followed him all his life? Chapter 2. The man in the shadows who shaped the fate of ACDC. In the 1970s, as ACDC began to rise to fame in Australia, audiences were captivated by Angus Young in his schoolboy uniform. Angus ran, spun, and stormed across the stage like a rebellious child, turning the guitar into a weapon. Bon Scott, wild and untamed, hurled every lyric like fire. All eyes were fixed on them. But if you looked closely, just behind the amplifiers stood a small man with long hair, barely moving. That was Malcolm Young. Malcolm never needed noise or attention. He stood still, a Gretsch Firebird in hand, his right hand hammering the strings with perfect precision. Each strike was as sharp as a steel hammer. That rhythm was the foundation, the heartbeat that kept the band from flying apart. One musician once said, If Angus was the fire, Malcolm was the engine. Without him, ACDC would have been nothing more than sparks in the dark. Few knew that Malcolm was also the decision-maker behind the scenes. He was the one who often made the toughest calls, firing managers, dismissing band members, even scrapping recordings that didn't meet his standards. A former crew member recalled that Malcolm always carried a small notebook. Inside were names of those he believed were no longer right for the band. A single nod from him could mean someone was gone from ACDC forever. What struck many was that Malcolm never explained. Those let go usually heard only one short line: "We're not on the same road anymore." No anger, no arguments, just a cold, final clarity. It made people both respect him and fear him. When Highway to Hell in 1979 and Back in Black in 1980 shook the world, Angus, Bon, and later Brian Johnson stood at the front. But behind the curtain, Malcolm steered the ship. Together with Angus, he created those immortal riffs. You Shook Me, All Night Long, Thunderstruck, Hell's Bells, each carried the stamp of Malcolm's iron right hand. A well-known guitarist once remarked, "The most unbelievable thing is that Malcolm never wanted credit. He said he was fine standing in the back, just keeping the rhythm. But the truth is, he was the reason ACDC existed at all." That silence created a paradox. The most powerful man in ACDC was the one seen the least. When asked questions, Malcolm answered in short, clipped sentences. He let others speak while he slipped back into the shadows. A close friend once said, Malcolm always had two sides. On stage, he was firm and unshakable. Off stage, he showed almost nothing, always holding a part of himself back. And in time, that silence became a question in itself. Why did the man who carried the soul of ACDC always choose to remain outside the spotlight? Chapter 3. When a love song became evidence of murder. In 1985, America was shaken. Police arrested Richard Ramirez, the serial killer dubbed the Night Stalker. Inside his apartment, investigators found ACDC t-shirts, cassette tapes, and most notably, the song Night Prowler. Overnight, the name AC/DC was tied to evil. The tabloids pounced. Front pages printed Ramirez's face alongside the band's lightning bolt logo. One pastor declared, "Their music is the voice of Satan." Christian groups called for boycotts. In small towns, parents banned their children from listening, branding ACDC's music as killer songs. Malcolm Young, a man who despised the spotlight, was suddenly thrown into the center of a storm. In one rare interview, he simply said, "It's a sad love song, not a murder ballad." But he knew words would not change the headlines. The press wasn't looking for truth. They wanted a scandal. Those close to the band recalled that, after the incident, ACDC almost never played Night Prowler again. No official reason was given, but the silence spoke volumes. To fans, it felt as if the song itself had been haunted. A friend remembered, Malcolm was tormented. He never believed music could drive someone to kill, but he hated the thought that one of his songs might forever be linked to violence. There was one haunting moment. At a late 1980s concert in America, the crowd roared for Night Prowler. Malcolm shook his head, leaned toward Angus, and whispered a few words. The band moved on. The song was never played that night. No one heard what he said. The Ramirez case left an invisible scar. For AC/DC as a whole, it was a scandal to overcome. But for Malcolm, who had always avoided attention, it felt like a personal accusation. A song about youthful loneliness had been twisted into a symbol of evil. And Malcolm, the man who had built its riff, bore the weight of suspicion. From that time on, journalists noticed a change. Malcolm spoke less in interviews, and sometimes avoided promotional appearances altogether. He stepped further back, leaving Angus and Brian to face the cameras. After shows, he no longer stayed to celebrate. He left quickly, quietly. One colleague sighed. Malcolm never liked the spotlight. But after Ramirez, it wasn't just avoidance. He seemed determined to disappear from it. Perhaps this was the first ghost that pushed Malcolm further away from public life. A silence no one could explain. Chapter 4. from the iron hand of discipline to a fall into alcohol. In 1988, just as ACDC was preparing for the Blow Up Your Video tour, Malcolm suddenly announced he was stepping away. The news stunned fans. For years, he had been the anchor, the man behind the rhythm, the pillar that could never be replaced. And now, on the eve of a major tour, he vanished. The reason, he admitted in a rare moment of honesty, was alcohol. Malcolm confessed, "I lost my way. The drink caught up with me. For years, he had used alcohol to push away exhaustion. But gradually, it began to consume him. Before shows, backstage, even while writing music, the glass was always there. Angus, his closest brother and partner in the band, pleaded with him, "I don't want to see you die like Bon Scott." Those words carried a heavy weight. Bon, the band's legendary frontman, had died in 1980 from alcohol poisoning. That wound still haunted ACDC, and Angus refused to let history repeat itself with his own brother. During Malcolm's absence, his nephew Stevie Young was called in to take his place. The tour went on, but something was missing. Reporters wrote, "The music was still thunderous, but there was an emptiness, as if the heartbeat itself was gone." Then came a strange detail. A close friend recalled that during this break, Malcolm disappeared for weeks. No one could reach him. Later, whispers suggested he had been hospitalized in secret after an alcohol-related seizure. The family never confirmed it. What was clear was that when Malcolm returned, the drinking was gone. His comeback was not loud or dramatic. He quietly slipped back into his familiar spot, picked up his Gretsch, and began pounding out the rhythm once more. The fans cheered, but his smiles were rare. When reporters tried to ask about his absence, he offered only the same curt response, "I just needed a rest." Nothing more, nothing less. A colleague later reflected, "Malcolm quit drinking, but I always felt he left part of his soul behind in that time. It was as though a crack had formed that would never heal." From 1988 onward, Malcolm was sober, more disciplined than ever, but the silence around him grew heavier. He spoke less after shows, rarely attended parties, and shrugged off questions about songwriting. What remained was only the sound of that steady, unshakable guitar. And that was the paradox. A man standing at the height of glory, while at the same time staring into the abyss of solitude. Was his fall into alcohol just a passing accident? Or was it the first sign that Malcolm was slowly withdrawing from the very world he had built? Chapter 5. The Vanishing Man. Illness or Concealment. After the Black Ice Tour in 2010, fans began to notice something strange about Malcolm. During a concert in Bucharest, he played the wrong intro to Shoot to Thrill. Only a few seconds, but for a man long considered the perfect rhythm machine, it was a disturbing sign. The crowd overlooked it, applauding anyway. No one knew it was the first glimpse of a long descent into darkness. Soon after, Malcolm's appearances grew fewer. At first, he simply missed a handful of events. Then he stopped showing up in interviews. Later, even in group photos, he was absent. When ACDC announced another tour, the question spread everywhere. Where is Malcolm? In 2014, the answer came. The band declared he was taking a break for health reasons. Months later, Australian newspapers revealed the truth. Malcolm had been diagnosed with dementia and was now under full-time care. Fans were shaken, yet the unsettling part was this. Why had no one outside his family, or a few close friends, known about his condition until then? Brian Johnson, the band's lead singer, later wrote in his memoir about being at the same medical facility. "I wanted to see Malcolm, but I was told I couldn't. They said it wasn't good for him. I left with a heavy heart." That detail troubled many fans. Why was a brother-in-arms of more than 30 years not allowed a final visit while Malcolm was still aware? Some suggested Malcolm's decline had begun years earlier, perhaps even during the Black Ice Tour. But the band chose silence, hiding it from the public, as if unwilling to let the world witness his collapse. A choice that was both protective and suspicious. One Sydney neighbor remembered, "I'd see him walking with a caretaker. His eyes down, no words spoken. just a familiar figure, but empty. A handful of rare photographs eventually surfaced. One showed Malcolm with distant eyes, tangled hair, and a face unrecognizable from his prime. Fans shared it widely, many exclaiming, "I can't believe that's Malcolm." Soon after, the family cut off nearly all public images. He vanished completely. Former friends recalled calling, only to have others answer the phone. No one was allowed to speak directly to Malcolm. The only explanation given? He needs rest. The silence grew into a wall. Then came one haunting remark. In an interview, Angus said, "Malcolm is still watching us in his own way." But he never explained what that meant. How could a man with failing memory watch at all? The statement deepened suspicions that his condition was far worse than the public was told. From 2010 to 2017, the world heard nothing from Malcolm Young. Only silence. And when news of his death was announced in November of 2017, many fans whispered, "We lost him long ago. Today was only the notice." And so, the painful question remains. When did Malcolm truly leave this world? Was it in 2017? Or years earlier, when his guitar fell silent for the last time on that stage in Bucharest? Chapter 6, A Solemn Funeral and the Unseen Void. On November 28, 2017, the bells of St. Mary's Cathedral in Sydney tolled with a mournful echo. Inside the grand church, the family sat in the front pew. His wife, Olinda, their 2 children, Ross and Cara, and his brother Angus, head bowed, heavy with grief. It was a solemn funeral, with wreaths sent from friends across the world. Yet one detail unsettled many who attended. The photograph on display was not recent, but one taken back in the 1990s, as if the final decade of Malcolm's life had simply been erased. A mourner later recalled, "There were no new pictures. I kept wondering, why weren't we allowed to see him one last time, even through a photograph?" That absence left fans with a lingering sense of being shut out. Outside the cathedral, hundreds of people stood in silence wearing their old ACDC shirts. They were not permitted to view the coffin, only to listen as "You Shook Me All Night Long" filled the air. Many wept, not only because a legend was gone, but because they had been denied a true farewell. During the service, Angus never gave a speech. He only rose, bowed his head, and stood in silence. That silence spoke more than any eulogy could. One musician who had known Malcolm shared that, before the end, he sometimes strummed a few chords on the guitar, only to stop and stare at it like it was a stranger. That story has never been confirmed, but for fans, just hearing it was enough to pierce the heart. When the ceremony ended, the coffin was carried away quietly. No television camera was allowed a close shot. And so, Malcolm left the world the same way he had lived those final years, wrapped in absolute silence. The true sorrow was not in his death, but in the hidden void that came before it. Why was an entire chapter of his life erased? And perhaps, had Malcolm already been dying slowly in silence long before November 28th, with that date serving only as the belated announcement? Conclusion: Malcolm Young, an eternal legacy and an unanswered question. Malcolm Young passed away at the age of 64. He was not the singer, not the face of the band, but he was its backbone, a musician, an architect of sound, the silent timekeeper. His legacy cannot be measured in sales charts, but in the weight of every right-hand chord, in those riffs that no one else could replicate. If Angus was the flame, Malcolm was the engine that kept it burning. Fellow musicians often admitted that Malcolm was the real commander of ACDC. He set the direction, enforced discipline, and preserved the band's identity. Yet the irony was this: he was also the one least spoken about. And maybe that is what deepened the tragedy. A man who chose silence ended his life in silence. Dementia stole his memory, pushed him away from the public eye. His family kept his condition private, leaving fans to learn the truth only when it was too late. His death felt less like an ending and more like a chapter that had been written years earlier, waiting only for its publication. The deepest wound was not just the loss, but the absence of a goodbye. Angus is still here. Bon Scott has become a legend. Brian Johnson remains on stage. But Malcolm, the man who built it all, faded quietly from collective memory, swallowed by silence. A rock journalist once wrote, "ACDC could survive without a singer, but not without Malcolm." And now, he is gone. The service at St. Mary's came to a close, but the questions linger. Why were his final years hidden? Why were old friends kept away? Did the family only wish to protect his image, or was there another pain that has never been revealed? For fans, Malcolm was more than a musician. He was the bitter reminder that even a genius can vanish into the shadows, that sometimes the strongest presence is the quietest one. Malcolm Young, the invisible heartbeat, left behind a legacy that will never fade. But along with it remains a haunting question. When did he truly leave this world? In 2017, or many years earlier, when his last guitar note had already fallen silent?